Hello everyone, I'm Simon Bembo, Learning Manager for Springboard, and I'm here to introduce the following webinar, an annual review of 2020. What a year, and so what an interesting time to review. Please note that as this webinar is pre-recorded, there will not be any ability to answer questions through the webinar. However, please do get in touch with us through your account manager if you're a client, or our website or email shown here if not. I'll now hand you over to Bal, your host for the 2020 annual review.
Good afternoon, and thank you for everyone for joining our webinar today. My name's Bal Chand, and I'm the Head of Marketing here at Springboard. I'll be chairing the webinar today and signposting our way through the next hour. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we kick off. Can you enter any questions you may have in the box on your screen, and we'll respond to as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. Following the webinar, those who manage to register before Friday will be sent a complimentary copy of the report, and for those who are interested in the report, you can find more details on our website. In normal pre-COVID circumstances, we review the year in terms of quarters and months. However, the repeated shocks to retail throughout the year, ranging from lockdowns to the reopening of retail to further lockdowns, means that it simply isn't relevant to evaluate the year using what we essentially have as arbitrary divisions of time. With this in mind, for the first time, we have reviewed the year both as a whole and using 6 periods that are defined by COVID events. And of course, we will highlight key trends in each of the 3 destination types: high streets, retail parks, and shopping centres. Springboard's Marketing and Insights Director, Diane will be taking you through the report, and you're in safe hands. Di has been analysing and providing insights on retailing for over 30 years and is regarded as one of the leading experts on retail and retail destinations, named as one of the world's top retail influencers in 2018 and 2019. With an unparalleled knowledge of and expertise in understanding current and emerging retail issues and consumer trends, Diane is a regular commentator on the performance of retail for national broadcast and print media, appearing regularly on BBC and Sky News. We also have 2 special guest panelists joining us today: Dominic Allport of the NPD Group and Sophie McCrow of 4 Communications, who I'll have the pleasure of introducing you to later on in the webinar. Before I hand over to Diane, I just wanted to understand how optimistic you are all about the prospects for retail and hospitality once lockdown has ended. I will set a poll live, which will follow up after the webinar to see if your outlook changes after looking at the trends that we discussed today. I'm now going to select the poll, so you should see a screen pop up on your webinar. I'd be grateful if you could choose between the 3 options that you have on how you feel about the prospects for retail and hospitality once lockdown has ended. Great, I can see we've got 75% vote so far. I'll give that a few more seconds. Perfect. So we've got 90% of the attendees have voted, which is great. And the responses on that are 28% of us are very optimistic, 59% remain uncertain, and 13% of us are not optimistic at all. And as mentioned, the follow-up survey after this webinar will reassess them views and see if there's been a change. Thank you. So we have a packed schedule for you today, so without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Diane. There you go.
Thanks, Val. Just find my transcript. So hopefully everyone can see this. Please do let me know if you can't, and Val will, I'm sure, let me know. What I'm going to do today, obviously, is take you through what happened last year, and I'm really excited to do that, not because it's been an amazing year for anyone, but because it's been such an unusual year and there's so much to talk about, and we want to be able to help you understand it better. Before I do that, I'm going to talk about what's happened previously, because that provides the context that is important to understand before we go forward. So for all those who know Springboard, and hopefully you all do, you certainly do now, we've been tracking footfall since 2002, and we've been publishing our data since 2008. So we've got a huge data set and a timeline against which we can look at trends. And what we've seen over that period is actually there's been this gradual decline in UK footfall in each year over that period from 2008 at about a 1.4% a year across all destinations, slightly higher in high streets, around 2% a year, and there's actually been an increase in footfall in retail parks. So overall, over that 10-year period, we've seen a 14.3% decline in footfall and a 20.5% decline in high streets, so pretty significant over 10 years. But it's not an even spread. What we've seen, and I think we all know that our smaller towns, our smaller high streets have been the places that have really struggled. And we've tracked that over the entire period, and we've seen footfall in what we define as market towns, coastal towns, historic towns. That decline has been much greater than in larger places like our regional cities and certainly in central London. So footfall in the smaller towns has declined by over 2% a year, whereas in central London it declined by just 0.9%. So there's a big difference, and so we can definitely have evidence that this is the smaller towns that were struggling. And the question is why? Well, of course, I think we all know why. It's partly the rise of the internet. And I say partly because, yes, spend has increased, and this graph shows that. In 2008, internet spend accounted for 4.9% of all retail spend, and increased to 19.1% by 2019. But it's not just the spend that's important here, it's the visits that it attracted previously to town centres and to shopping centres. So before the internet, before online became as big a channel as it is now, we would go into high streets for incidentals and for intangibles. But of course, a lot of those you can now buy online. So that actually reduced the number of visits we made to high streets, and with it, the spend that accompanied those visits. So we would probably spend money on things we didn't intend to spend when we went into town centres, but of course, when you don't go, you don't spend that money. So it's had a massive hit on our high streets and our destinations. So that was where we started when we turned the corner for 2020. So I'm going to now look at 2020 in quite a lot of detail, clearly. Bal mentioned the time periods that are very important for 2020, and I'm not going to go into those in detail. They're actually in the report, and we look at the impact on footfall and other indicators and metrics within each of those time periods within the document. But I'm going to focus on the overall and the significant trends that have emerged out of 2020. So the first one, the overriding one, is that footfall has declined to a level that we've never previously recorded. I did actually have the word unprecedented in this header until this morning, and I actually removed it because I think unprecedented must be the most used word in 2020, and I was desperately trying not to use it, but it is unprecedented. Footfall dropped by 39.1% across all of our bricks and mortar destinations, and by more than that in our high streets and our shopping centres. In retail parks, footfall dropped by less, just 23%, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But there is a clear difference between the performance of our urban destinations, our high streets and our shopping centres from our retail parks. So Bal mentioned these time periods that were defined by COVID in 2020, and there are 6 of these. So the first one was what I call pre-COVID, and that was between January and February last year, where there was mumbles and rumbles about COVID in China, but it really wasn't something that had any great influence on us at that point. The second period was lockdown 1, which is really when COVID hit us big time, and that was the period from March to June. And that 3-month period, I think we all felt it very harshly. And then retail reopened at the back end of June. So it was really July before we felt the benefit of that. And that was our retail reopening period. At the end of October, of course, we started to see rises in infection rate. And so the government took the decision to introduced a lockdown in England in November. And there were myriad of different restrictions before that, as we know, but actually the lockdown happened in November. And I mention England because actually in the UK as a whole, England drives overall footfall to a far greater extent than the devolved nations. There's just more people in England than in the other countries. So if you have a lockdown in England, it will push down the overall result for the UK. At the end of November, retail reopened, but unfortunately that was just for a couple of weeks, from the beginning to the mid-December, and then in the second half of December we went into Tier 4 restrictions, and right at the end of the month, lockdown 3. So that is the year really as we had it. And here you can see it set out in this graph, and you can see the extent to which it hit footfall in March. So after the start of lockdown 1, footfall plummeted to a low of 82.2%, lower than it was in 2019, and just a massive drop. And then we can see the reopening of retail in week 25, and that was at the end of June, middle of June. And you can see the uplift that occurred in that week alone, and that was about 40%. And then there was a steady rise in footfall, peaking in the end of August after they'd introduced the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. And footfall was 25% lower than 2019. And then, of course, it tapered off slightly, and then not significantly. And you can see why lockdown 2 happened, and that pushed footfall down again. Yes, again, it went up when lockdown 2 ended, and then lockdown 3 happened and it dropped again. So that was the year really in the shape of last year, a very, very unusual shape, but one that's now become very familiar to me. And here just summarizes the degree of impact that these different periods had on footfall. So we can see pre-COVID, we had virtually a normal year, drop of 2.6%. It was slightly bigger than the previous year. But lockdown 1, a huge drop of an average of 71.4. We haven't seen that drop as much since then, probably until now. But the second lockdown, of course, schools were open, and that made a big difference. But still, footfall dropped by 52.2%. So what does all this mean for retail and retail destinations? Well, the first trend that we saw was that retail parks were the clear winners. I talked about the decline in footfall across the 3 destination types of high streets, shopping centres and retail parks. And you can see that where high streets and shopping centres both had declines of footfall of more than 40%, in retail parks the decline was just over 20%, 23%. And here is the shape of footfall in retail parks. It follows the same line as high streets and shopping centres, but it's just much less severe. And what are the reasons for this? Well, the key reason, and I think we probably all recognise, is that a lot of retail parks, in fact the majority, have a food store on them. So we have to visit retail parks if we're going to buy food in a food store. Secondly, of course, they're almost perfectly set up to deal with COVID. You can travel to a retail park by car. You don't rely on public transport to get there. When you get there, parking is free, which is always good for people, but it's open air, it's spaced out. The stores are large, so social distancing is much easier. All of these factors make retail parks the ideal places for people to shop during COVID. But inevitably, because fewer people are going to destinations and to stores, we identified that sales in bricks and mortar stores dropped hugely by 20% last year, compared to just a drop of 3% the year before. And this is quite interesting because this is actual drops in bricks and mortar sales, but rather than total retail sales, which includes online. And you can see there's a difference between the categories here. The smallest drop in footfall, the smallest drop in sales occurred in health and beauty outlets, where sales dropped by just under 9%. And the largest drop were in services, which of course are largely intangible. And so if you don't have to go to a bank or a building society or a post office or an estate agent or a travel agent, indeed we weren't traveling, then you can do that online. So it's inevitable that category saw the greatest drop. But fashion accessories, which I guess are the barometer for our urban destinations, their sales dropped by 20.2%. So that's bang on with the national trend. So clearly footfall is important to sales in store, and footfall drops the sales did too. But what also was very interesting is that store capture rates changed very little. And for those who aren't familiar with capture rates, This is the percentage of footfall that enters a store from a street or a mall, and essentially it's the market share of a store in a location. So what retailers are looking for is to not only measure that, but then understand whether that is moving upwards or downwards, and the ideal situation that it doesn't move downwards. A retailer doesn't want its capture rate to decline. It wants to track trend. So where footfall goes up outside the store, so customers coming into the store goes up, and so the capture rate is level. And what we've seen here is that actually proportionately stores attracted a similar proportion of shoppers they did in 2019. The biggest drop was actually in entertainment and books, and this is a fairly logical result. These are very easily bought online and much more transferable online, certainly than food and beverage, where you can actually see that the capture rate for food and beverage went up. So proportionately, food and beverage outlets, so cafes, coffee shops, restaurants, attracted more footfall than destinations. So it shows the importance of these places, and it shows that people wanted to go out to eat and drink. And Dominic will touch on that more in his presentation. Speaking of which, because there was less footfall out there in retail destinations, the visits to eating out venues plummeted as well by 43.4% in 2020, compared to a rise of 0.5% in 2019. So you can see the huge impact that had on our hospitality industry. And I've looked here just at 3 categories of eating out venues, what we call QSR, and Dominic will talk more about this, quick service restaurants, so that's our Burger Kings and our McDonald's, where footfall dropped by, visits dropped by 33%. And you compare that to pubs, where visits dropped by 51%. And we know the impact that COVID and restrictions and lockdowns have had on pubs. A key trend was online spending. And in addition to the word unprecedented, I think the next most used word in the COVID year was acceleration. And really online spending has accelerated enormously. And actually it's gone beyond what we forecast for 2028. So the growth in online spending has been astronomical. But of course you would expect that if non-essential stores are shut, where else do you buy product? So when we started the year in January and February, online spending as a proportion of total retail spending was around 19.7%. By the end of the year, it increased to 38%. Now, that isn't evenly spread across food and non-food, and you can see that from the other 2 sections of the graph. Food shopping online has increased, in fact, it's doubled over the year from 5.6% at the beginning of the year to 11.5% by the end, but it's still only just more than 1 in 10 shoppers are actually buying online. So the vast majority of people still go to food stores to buy their food, and that's really what is supporting our retail parks. Now compare that to non-food, where the year started with just 15.7% of non-food spendings being spent online. In the lockdown 1, which is essentially the period from March to May, that rose to 34.8%. So more than a third of all non-food spending was online, which is interesting because people were still spending in store even though it was a lockdown. That dropped back obviously when retail reopened to 25%, but in the latter part of the year it's actually uplifted again to 43.6% of non-food. So nearly a half of all non-food spending was spent online by the end of the year. Now, another key trend, and one which we actually managed to identify very, very early on in the piece, in fact, just a couple of weeks into lockdown, really, lockdown 1, was the rise of what we call localism. So the growing importance of our local high streets, our small high streets. And I talked about the trend, the long-term trend, which was for the greater resilience of our biggest towns and cities against our smaller towns that really struggled. And this is shown in the table on the left, which really shows in 2019 alone, the drop in footfall in historic towns, in coastal towns, and in market towns, all of which are smaller towns, was more than 3%. In central London, the drop was just 0.8%. In outer London, 1.2%, and in regional cities, so that's our Birmingham's and our Leeds and our Liverpool's, 1.8%. So you can see that cities were much more resilient. Turn the table, 2020, very different picture. The smaller towns, because we're working at home and we're stuck in our houses and we're not traveling, smaller towns actually were much more resilient, and the drop in footfall in our market towns, our coastal towns, were in their 30s, so a drop of 36.6% in market towns. Historic towns slightly more at 44.2%, compared with central London at 58.7%. So much smaller drop in our coastal towns, and this is of course across the year. In lockdown, we've actually seen drops in footfall in central London of over 80%, and we're seeing that at the moment actually with the lockdown 3 that we're right in the middle of. So huge drop in footfall in central London, and of course that is due to the loss of working population, of course, but for central London it's also due to the fact that it has a, you know, everything that makes it an iconic shopping destination actually works against in COVID. It has a huge reliance on public transport to move people around, and people don't want to travel in public transport. It has a huge reliance on tourism, both domestic and overseas. Well, that's virtually gone or completely gone. And then the working population, and then of course leisure and entertainment, all of which is closed. So London is really has been dealt a hammer blow. But this slide here looks at shopping centres, and you know, it's not only localism in high streets that it applied to shopping centres as well. And what we were seeing previous to COVID, back in 2009 and even years before that, was that our smaller shopping centres, and we classify shopping centres into different size bands. Shopping centres of up to 100,000 square feet and 250,000 square feet were seeing bigger drops in footfall than the larger preeminent shopping malls that we all know. And those were seeing declines of just 0.8% in footfall in 2019. 2020, the tables turned, and it's the smaller shopping centres in smaller high streets generally that had lower footfall drops. So in centres up to 100,000 square feet, footfall dropped by 40%. In centres of over 500,000 square feet, the drop was 46.6%. So things have shifted around, and shopping centres are benefiting from localism. The next trend is consumer confidence. Well, somewhat inevitably, as we would expect, consumer confidence weakened, and that was considerable. In fact, the measurement of consumer confidence, which is an index score of consumer confidence, halved. So in 2019, it wasn't great at -13, but by 2020, it had dropped to -26. And in large part, that was an uncertainty and a worry around the economic situation, both actually, funnily enough, the previous year, but also over the coming year too. And the major purchase index, which is the propensity for people to want to spend money on big things, big items and big spend items, dropped hugely from a positive score of 2 to a minus score of 27. So you could see the nervousness of people during 2020. And what impact has had all of that had on actually occupation and on the ground and the number and type of retailers that we see out there? Well, we know we've had some high profile failures in 2020, the closure of Debenhams, the closure of Arcadia, and a number of other stores that have gone into administration or ceased trading altogether. And what we're seeing here is that this is starting to cascade through to the vacancy rate. And Springboard actually undertakes a vacancy rate each quarter. And so we've got 3 quarters here. We've got January. We would have undertaken it in April as well, but of course we were in lockdown, so it wasn't really appropriate, or we weren't able to do that. But the next one we undertook was in July, just after we were opened, and it had increased marginally in July from January, from 9.8% in January through to 10.8% in July. So from a point where it was better than 2019 in January, it was worsened. By October, that gap between 2019 and 2020 had widened even further, to from 10% in 2019 to 11.3% in 2020. So we can see that the economic conditions and the impact on retail and hospitality of lockdowns are really starting to bite in terms of which businesses are still managing to remain in situ and still trading. So tough times, definitely. So looking forward to 2021 and beyond. So what I've done, I've put some predictions rather than what I would call a forecast here. because we're not really in a position to, at this stage, give a forecast in terms of the decline in footfall, but we are able to look at what we think we predict might happen for this year and beyond this year. Well, I think the first prediction is that the year is really going to be split into two key periods: a pre-vaccine period, where we are now, and a post-vaccine period. And at the moment, we don't really have any firm idea as to when the post-vaccine period will start in earnest, but that is latterly when, I think it's most likely when all the key vulnerable groups have been vaccinated. So that's going to be summer at least, possibly autumn. So we need to think about pre-vaccine period and post-vaccine period. And during the pre-vaccine period, the restrictions and social distancing measures will need to continue, obviously. When we get into the post-vaccine period, which I think we're all desperate to have, we're predicting that there's going to be this initial surge to stores and destinations. What we did see over the lockdown one, which indicates that, is that there was this general uptick in footfall over the lockdown period. Even though people weren't supposed to be out, even the stores were shut, people were desperate to go out. So footfall was steadily creeping up. And in fact, when retail opened, and it was only retail initially that opened, not hospitality, footfall rose in a single week by 40%. So we're expecting to see that really with knobs on almost. People are even more desperate to reclaim their lives and to get back to some form of normality. So we're expecting to see people really, really keen to get out. But at the same time, home working, which I'm sure the majority of us are doing today, has been firmly established, and the days of us trooping into our offices 5 days every week are long gone, really, particularly those who are working in large city centres. We've proven that home working works really well, and there is no decline in output or efficiency, so that is likely to continue moving forward. And that means there's going to be fewer trips to larger centres. As consumers, we won't be buying our sandwiches in Liverpool city centre or Manchester city centre as much as we did, because we won't be there. But what we will do is plan our trips to larger centres more carefully and make them more of a day out, and we'll have longer dwell times. So therefore, it's important for cities to make sure that they're appealing for visitors, to make sure they want to stay for longer dwell times and make sure they want to plan their trips to those places. Side by side with that will be an ongoing loyalty to our smaller centres. There is a debate as to whether we'll just rebound into our old patterns of behaviour and our smaller centres will really struggle. But as we continue to work from home, our closest places to buy our essentials will be our smaller centres. And actually, I think there's been a lot of newfound and regenerated loyalty to small local businesses, and people want to support them economically. In one of our reports that we carried out last year, just before Christmas, it was a Christmas Unwrapped with COVID report. People were saying that they wanted to shop locally, they wanted to shop in smaller stores, and retail was open then. So we're predicting that there will be this loyalty. But there will be some relocation out of London. There are lots of people living in very expensive residential apartments and houses, and they don't need to be in London anymore, particularly if they're not in their office 5 days a week. So already estate agents have seen an uptick in interest in viewings of properties out in the country and outside of London, and that will start to accelerate as we go on and the home working trend becomes much more firmly established. And all of this will lead to a shift in the peak footfall days. At the moment, footfall still peaks on Saturday. Peak times are still around lunchtime. But of course that will change, particularly for larger centres. The peak time in a city centre may not be Saturday lunchtime. It may well be a week evening or a Saturday evening. And that's what we need to look at. We need to track that as we move through and to see the extent to which those shifts are taking place in the days that we visit and the times that we visit. So it looks like there's going to be this mini boom, if not a boom, then a resurgence of retail as we come out of lockdown. But at the same time, retail is going to compete with hospitality, travel and leisure. I think probably one of the key sentiments that most people feel is the need to reconvene and meet up with family and friends. And that will be about hospitality. Yes, retail will benefit from that, but it will be about eating out, drinking, being able to sit down in a great place, share a meal, and share experiences. And also people want to travel. Probably a lot of us have had our holidays rearranged or cancelled, but the opportunity to travel will be there, and that will be a desire that most people have. And then of course leisure. So all of that will be a pull on spend away from retail. We'll only have a certain amount of money in our pocket. Where do we spend it? We've got a large proportion of online shoppers, as we've seen from the numbers, will have never shopped online before 2020, and now they are new online shoppers. So we are expecting a proportion of those will remain as online shoppers. So online shopping will rebase at a higher level than it did when 2020 started. It won't be as high as it is now because some people want to go back to buying in stores and destinations, but it will be higher because people will get used to using online shopping, certainly for functional items, because it's easy and it's convenient. And consequently, footfall rebase at a lower level. We have to expect that footfall will not come back to a level that we saw in 2019 and the years before that. And finally, I think we need to consider the impact of rising unemployment. The furlough scheme is due to end at the end of April. We know already that unemployment has been rising. We know the huge impact that lockdowns have had on retail and hospitality employment. And so as that increases, that may well act as a constraint on how much spending will rise. Certainly for people who are in jobs and who are lucky enough to have jobs, they're probably feeling quite wealthy because they haven't actually been spending that much on going out to eat and drink and going on holiday. So they've probably got some savings or some money to spend when lockdown ends. But for those who don't have a job, it's going to be really tough. And across the UK, that will constrain spending, certainly in some locations. So thanks for listening. So pleased I can share insights. As I said, there's much more information within our annual review, so certainly about individual time periods. So please feel free to dip into that, and very, very happy to take questions and to speak after the event as well. Now, I'm going to hand over back to Val, and we're now going to hear from our guest panelists.
Thank you, Di. So that was really insightful. And as you all heard and know, 2020 was a year like no other, with every industry being impacted, and in particular, the hospitality industry, which has been amongst the hardest hit. So that leads me on to our first guest panelist, who will be able to provide a bit more insight into the impact to the industry. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dominic Orpel, Insights Director and Head of UK Food Services at the NPD Group. Some of the world's leading brands rely on the NPD Group to get the right products in the right places for the right people. They're the leading source of insights on trends, performance and indicators, and market sizing in more than 20 industries, with their long-standing expertise in hospitality and food service. With more than 2 decades in insights, market research and consultancy, Dominic leads on much of the thought leadership within the company's European food service practice, and has regular input into the locational strategy development. Providing insights and analysis to broadcast and print media, Dominic will be discussing the impact of COVID on the hospitality industry and the trends we've seen emerge. Now, I'll just hand over to you, Dominic. Here we go.
Thank you very much. Let me just get this working. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. So I've got 10 minutes to take you on a whistle-stop tour of food service in 2020. I'm going to try and build on some of Diane's points, but as Diane said, there's more detail in the report. And also, if you want to get in contact directly after this webinar, then we can obviously talk about things in more detail. So I'm just going to talk about these 3 elements in the next 10 minutes. Firstly, a bit of background about who the NPD Group are. And I think it's important to make clear that NPD stands for national purchase diary and not new product development. It's one of those strange acronyms that we have. But what NPD tracks is we track about 14 different countries globally for food service, and this accounts for about 65% of total global food service. And we have a consumer panel called CREST, where I've pulled most of the data from, and this tracks what consumers are doing and saying and reporting to us on a daily basis. So the 3 different product areas that we have within NPD's food service offering is Sales Track, which is our sales, and EPOS Read, which comes directly from operators, in particular quick service restaurant operators. We have Crest, which I'm going to highlight some trends from in a minute, and then SnapMy on the right hand side there. That is our receipt-based tracking app, which gives you a lot of granular detail about what actually consumers are buying and what sort of products they're purchasing. So a little bit of background in terms of where we are in the eating out market and where it's going. I think it's fair to say that food service has been on quite a journey during 2020. I've heard, if you think back to 1992, the Queen talking about 1992 being an annus horribilis. I think most food service operators would say that 2020 was an annus horribilis. I'm trying to avoid saying the word unprecedented here, Diane. And what has happened is, if we break down 2020 into a little bit more detail, we had at the beginning of the year what was effectively seen as a sort of Boris bounce. We'd had the general election, people knew what was going on, Brexit was getting done, if not fully done, and there was this little bounce back versus the previous year, 0.4% growth in visits. And just to be clear, visits are similar to footfall, in that they track the number of people visiting eating out places. Then, unfortunately, we had COVID arrive on our shores, and the rest of the year resulted post March really with a 52% decline in year-on-year visits. And what's important to note here is it hasn't hit all sectors the same way. Those casual dining operators I'm thinking of in particular, who are very focused on premise, have been disproportionately hit by this. And as Diane highlighted before, pubs also have been hit. And what we've seen is actually about a 20% decline in casual dining outlet numbers. When you're thinking about key branded outlet operators, in particular those operating within the Italian cuisine space, they have been disproportionately hit. So you'll have heard of the CVAs and the restructuring that's happened there. But it's not just been on premise that's been affected. I mean, as we build this chart, you can see that it follows a similar chart to that seen by Diane, and for retail footfall, we can fell to calamitously low levels in April, down about 80%, and then the slow reopening that happened during the course of the year. And what's interesting is August, Eat Out to Help Out happened, and it helped certain parts of the market more than it helped the market overall. So this meant that consumers effectively switched channels. They moved away from maybe quick service restaurants momentarily into sitting down and eating outside while the weather was good. But then slowly the reimposition of lockdowns and further tightenings, tier tightenings, resulted in a drop once more. But I want to talk a little bit more about QSR in the short time I have, because QSR have done particularly well. They are down only a third over the course of a year, rather than 46% over the course of a year. And this is really because they've tapped into some of the key trends that were happening already in the eating out market. And these trends were the proliferation of sales channels. Multiple sales channels is the way to interact with consumers on a day-to-day basis. And if we start pulling out those numbers, we can see that while we saw big top-level declines over the course of a year, within quick service, important elements of quick service restaurants, because all of these types of order channels fall under the umbrella of off-premise, and off-premise represents about 85% of all quick service restaurant visits. So with the fact that delivery was up, the fact that collection was up so strongly, and represented a larger proportion of the total in 2020 versus 2019, meant that QSR operators were better insulated against declines. I've also highlighted drive-through on the right-hand side there, and while at over 2020 those figures don't look that impressive, drive-through actually came back very strongly in Q4 or in the latter half of 2020, and drive-through really falls into that view of almost the car as the ultimate PPE equipment. You're protected, you're safe, you've got your private space, and you're not really interacting too much with the outside world. So if you want to escape the boredom of lockdown, a drive-through is an alternative, and with more people driving than is normally the case, drive-through has benefited. So where do we go from here? I think a lot of this is very difficult to pin down, and these four elements are going to be key to the future prosperity of food service as much as it is retail. And like Diane said, it's going to be a year of two halves. When those two halves actually kick in is a moot point, but the first half is going to be very much business as it is currently, with a lot of focus on delivery, drive-through, sort of contactless behavior. And then once we all have had needles in our arms and had our jabs, then the reopening of restaurants will hopefully happen with no additional wave of COVID to deal with. But some of that is going to be limited by consumers' desire to go back to old ways. It may be the case that holidays are going to be more staycations rather than overseas, so there will be benefits for certain locations around the UK where people tend to go for staycations. So I think regional in terms of who benefits most. Those on coastal areas, for example, are likely to see another strong summer as they did last year. Then you're going to have this point about pre-COVID travel hubs, and anything to do with travel was strong, and that was aeroplanes, trains, even cars. But now possibly it's going to be more focused on road and car transport only, and less on certainly overseas. And then we had home working, which was around 10% pre-COVID. It shot up to about 40 or 50%. It's not going to go back down to 10%. I think it's clear we're going to see this hybrid model where we're occasionally in the office, occasionally at home. So back to this point that Diane was making about suburban areas, local independents, which have attracted habitual visits and loyalty from their consumers. They are the ones that are going to benefit long term. So in terms of the top trends for 2021, I think without a doubt we're going to see delivery continue to boom, and it's not just going to be from the traditional families and young people. It's also going to be older, more affluent consumers who have tried delivery for the first time. And I read somewhere that it takes 2 months for a habit to form, and once a habit is formed, it's very difficult to break. So I think while delivery might not be as strong and as important as it is currently, it's not going to diminish significantly, because around 37% of consumers have told us they will continue with delivery, whereas before it was less than a third before COVID. Digital awareness will obviously be key. It keeps consumers safe, digital and contactless. And today I read about contactless limits potentially going up to £100, so people can really enjoy themselves at their restaurant without being worried about hygiene. And obviously that gives a lot of customer data to operators, and that's a useful way to interact and market directly to consumers. So that trend is certainly going to continue. And in quick service, there are lots of players who are actually thinking of expanding at the moment. To name a couple of them, Tim Hortons, which is a Canadian coffee shop player, they are going to continue to expand. Five Guys, you've probably heard of, they will continue to expand. So while we've seen casual dining affected by store closures and restructuring, quick service restaurants are likely to continue to try and expand. And outside space will become that much more important. I think we've all tried it this winter, sitting outside, trying not to feel too cold. So I think the outside space around restaurants will increasingly be an additional area of focus and development. And then obviously to try and keep a lid on costs, menus will continue to be re-engineered, and slow sales, products which are selling less well than others, will probably be removed. Still in the air, as well as this increasing level of lockdown fatigue, I think we're seeing a two-tier approach from consumers. Some consumers, as Diane said, have saved money. Others have been more impacted financially. So I think different catchment areas and different consumers are going to react differently to reopening, depending on whether they're in full-time employment and the state of their finances. And then there's also this lagging concern amongst consumers that one in five consumers still think restaurants are an area of risk for COVID infections. But on a more positive note, around half of respondents are still missing eating out, and 75%, 3 out of 4, want to return to restaurants. So I think, back to Diane's point, there will be a sort of boom once restrictions are removed, but a lot of that is down to the levels of tiering that we're likely to see during 2021. We've tried to, just to finalize this point, we've tried to scenario plan some of this. So if anyone is interested in knowing more detail about our views on how we see 2021 and 2022 playing out, we have, similar to the Bank of England model, we've created a number of scenarios, pessimistic, optimistic, and then a sort of central view. And we've thrown in a lot of influences from the economy, from food service itself. So please get in contact if anyone wants to know more about that. That was all I was going to cover, but I think it's really important just to remember that there is that doom and gloom currently, but back to this point about resilience, innovation that we've seen in the restaurant industry, certainly with pivoting towards meal kits and trying to sell directly to consumers. There will be a fresh wave of innovation that happens, and I think those that are remaining and still trading at the end of the COVID pandemic will emerge more strongly. Thank you. Okay, let me now try and hand you back. So I will stop sharing my screen and hand you back to Val.
Thank you, Dominic. That was really interesting, and I think it really brings home the impact COVID has had on the hospitality industry. But like you point out, that there's still hope that we'll bounce back and see resilience that is shown in prior years. But not only has COVID impacted the market, it's also impacted us as individuals and how we go about our daily lives. This impact has changed how we will act moving forward, and leads us perfectly to our next panelist, Sophie McCrow, Strategy and Insights Director at 4 Communications. Now, Sophie heads up the team behind Mapper 360, which is 4's proprietary suite of smart insight capabilities. 4 are able to create content-rich campaigns which drive footfall and spend, backed by real-time insights through the Mapper 360 software. And some of the biggest UK shopping centres, high streets and town centres are using this. With 10 years experience working with property, retail and destination clients, Sophie's known for her creative approach to using data to build comms strategies. Using trends analysis and real-time social digital data mapped from Mapper 360, Sophie will discuss with you how retail and fashion customers are radically changing in the face of the new post-pandemic climate-focused world. And I will now hand over to Sophie. There you go.
Thank you very much, Val. I'm going to get you to introduce me on all my presentations, I think. I enjoyed that very much. I am thrilled to be here talking to you all today, and I'm really excited to share some of the findings from our work we've done identifying new customer types that we think will shape retail in 2021. And if any of you doubted Diane's forecasting and fortune telling ability, she's not only predicted some of the trends that I'm going to highlight, but also that I'm going to use the words unprecedented and accelerated in the first 2 minutes. So I will get my COVID communications cliches out of the way nice and early, but that won't be all of the alliteration for the day, as you'll see in a moment, but bear with me. So 2020 has been a year of unprecedented change for all of us, and as Dominic and Diane have already shown, retail and F&B was hit particularly hard over the year by some of the enforced changes in our consumer behaviour. As consumers, as people, there's been accelerated change in how and where we live, work and shop. That's the last one, I promise. There's been accelerated change in how and where we live, work, shop and spend our leisure time. And so, it's not the last one, now more than ever, understanding the motivations and barriers to getting people back out and spending are going to be key to helping retail destinations navigate the turbulence that's been caused by the pandemic. But it's not all doom and zoom, and what I would like to share with you today is a snapshot of insights from our new customers report and help you understand how you can engage consumers who are still spending to help fuel recovery. To find these insights, we've used our proprietary insights methodology, Mapper 360, and we've analysed thousands of social media, digital and search data points to understand the macro trends that have taken off during and post-lockdown. And then we've profiled the audiences who are driving those trends to see how they're spending and what they're spending on. So introducing our high-value consumers. The analysis that we did showed 7 macro trends, and these are the associated high-value consumer typologies that we've brought together from those insights. And these are the consumers that really embody and drive the macro trends that we've observed across the retail and leisure sectors. And today we're going to focus on 3. So that's preparation Pete and careful Carol, local Lucy and re-evaluation Rick. So without further ado, let's meet the first of our consumer types. Pete and Carol have become a much more prominent typology over the last year, really characterised by their increased forward planning and a slightly more spend conscious approach to how they go about their lives. But that's about being prepared. So that's using sales and deals so that there's always birthday cards and a couple of emergency presents in case they forget. That is using January when all the Christmas decorations are reduced to stock up for next year. So this is about forward planning and being prepared. And the increase in that behaviour can perhaps be explained a little bit by what we see Pete and Carol engaging with on social. So they took on social media or adopted social media actually to keep up to date with Brexit updates. But then you have Brexit and then you have COVID and all the political tumult that you have in the world. And actually what we can see is that that kind of uncertainty has made them feel a lot more uncertain about their own place in the world. So whilst Pete and Carol aren't struggling financially, they're much more aware of their finances and thinking about what they need their savings and income to support looking ahead. So this is about being more cautious rather than easing back on spending entirely. And that's shown through kind of the interests and affinities that we saw for them. So they want to make their money go further. So we see they're following money savvy influencers like Martin Lewis, for example. Pete and Carol value heritage and provenance. And they choose British products where possible, which is good news for a lot of the kind of independent and small businesses in the UK, some of which, or a lot of which, have actually started during lockdown. And interestingly, their home is everything to them. So there was a lot of kitchen renovation going on amongst the Pete and Carol audience that we saw, which is slightly at odds with the cautious spending that we talked about, but it's about improving their home space. This group is particularly interesting because they are big domestic tourists. Speaking to our travel specialist team, older travellers, or kind of golden boomers as they called them, are actually going to be fueling tourism recovery both domestically and internationally. So Pete and Carol are a really important consumer type for some of those market and coastal towns to think about, both as residents but also as visitors, and trying to engage them more with your destination offering when they're travelling around the country. Our second consumer type is local Lucy. Again, this will reflect some of what Diane was saying earlier. So high streets and local shopping destinations love local Lucy. So 2020 really helped Lucy feel much more connected to the community around her and renewed her appreciation of her local area. And this didn't just manifest itself through supporting her elderly neighbours, but also about how and where she was spending her money. So retail destinations love Lucy because she's actually helping to sustain local high streets, and in particular she's embracing the kind of shop small, shop independent trends that we already saw emerging actually before 2020, but really they increased and became much more prominent over the last year. Lucy cares a lot about supporting charities that work towards meaningful change in society, but particularly on that kind of community and small scale. And she is particularly engaged with ones that promote what she sees as British values. So you'll see Help for Heroes up on the left of that screen now. So that's a good example of that. But she's particularly interested in those that help focus on the most vulnerable, and she cares really deeply about her community. So positive messages showing how local businesses are embracing these values and supporting the community that they're part of will be particularly important for engaging Lucy and will help keep a connection with her during lockdown. And finally, I want to introduce you to Rick, Re-evaluation Rick. So lockdown was a real reset moment for the Ricks of the world, and he represents a few important trends for retail destinations, which are going to be really important for shaping recovery and beyond. The most striking thing I found about Rick in this typology was their attitude to lockdown overall. One thing I found it quite shocking, 1 in 5 said they would miss lockdown more than they want to get rid of it, which on some days is incredibly hard for me to relate to, but on other days actually I can really connect with that feeling. But broadly what that means is that Rick had the opportunity to reflect on what's important to him and his family and make some fairly significant decisions on the back of that. And at the bottom of the screen you'll see that quite a large proportion, there was a big increase in searches for starting a new business. That's the kind of decision that we're talking about, and change in a lifestyle. But perhaps most important for the people on this webinar is actually where Rick lives and works. So he would previously have been 5 days a week in the office, sort of working in central London type, but living outside. But our work on this report and developing insights for some of our commercial property clients has told us and shown us that actually the shift to home working is likely to have a much more lasting impact on city centre destinations that rely on office workers like Rick. And we've seen Rick choosing now to spend much less time in the office when it's open, and he wants to spend more time at home, and it's a shift to a much more split kind of home working, office working way of living his life, and that's infecting where he's choosing to live. So Diane alluded to this earlier, but there's been a big increase in kind of property searches for rural locations and smaller towns. So where Lucy was focused, for smaller towns, so they're getting a real boost, but it is a real challenge for kind of big urban centres, and regional urban centres I think in particular have been struggling with this kind of shift away or loss of the office population, and sort of engaging them and getting them to spend longer when they're there will be really key for the next year. But looking at some of his interests and affinities, where local Lucy was focused on kind of the small scale close to home, Rick is he is much more concerned by macro issues like sustainability, arts and culture, and equality. And so the kind of key takeaway for us here is that brands and retail destinations that want to engage Rick should think about their purpose, if they can authentically kind of communicate a purpose, but their purpose, partnership, and overall their impact when they're trying to engage Rick. And try to bring that to the front. So talking about, say, environment and sustainability, for example, will really connect with him if you have something authentic that you can draw on and say to him. So what I've shown you just now, and time flies when you're having fun, what I've just shown you are 3 of the influential consumer typologies that we identified as part of this bigger piece of research. There were 7 here overall, but that is the tip of the iceberg in terms of what consumer personas and personalities can be. So in terms of how retail destinations can make use of these digital and social insights, it's really about understanding what your proposition is and how you can connect that with your target customers. You may recognise yourself in one of the typologies I've taken you through today, or you may recognise your target audiences. I was a nesting Natasha, for anyone that cared. We talked about maybe a hibernating Harriet yesterday as well, who wasn't shown here. But when you recognise what your customers want and what they need from a destination, that makes the big challenge understanding your proposition and how you connect that to your audiences. Right now, that means developing communications which can forge and maintain relationships with consumers even while shops, restaurants and leisure facilities are closed. But from the work that we've done at 4, as I said, it's not all doom and gloom. From the work we've done, we can see that it is possible to do this. It's just about finding the right tone and the relevant messages to create cut through, and being quite agile and able to adapt what you're doing to meet the changing rules, the changing regulations, and also what your tenants and resident businesses need. And that was a whistle-stop tour of everything you need to know about consumer behaviour changing as a result of lockdown. And I will hand you back over to Bal to bring it home.
Thank you so much, Sophie. And I think I can really resonate with some of the personas you've identified. And I know for sure, post-pandemic, my buying habits will change and my behaviour has changed, and those around me is very much the same. So it'll be interesting to see how businesses adapt and communicate to these new audiences that you've identified. Now, that is all from our panelists. So we will now turn things around and open the webinar up for participants to ask questions. I am conscious we are slightly over time, but hopefully those that can still stay on will stay on the call, and we'll just go through some of the questions that have been asked. So the first question I have here is, there is a big disparity between age groups and those who are vaccinated sooner than others, e.g. the 70-plus-year-old brackets vaccinated by spring, 30-year-olds plus not by until late autumn. Are you expecting to see a difference in demographic of visitors, and what impact will this have?
So shall I take that, Val?
Yeah, over to you, Di.
I think inevitably what we'll see is that those who are vaccinated and therefore feel safe will start to return. But of course, at the same time, the older shopping population tends to be larger, and this is a generalisation, much more cautious than younger people. So I think the fear of COVID has been brought home to them over this year. And whilst they are vaccinated, I think they will still be nervous. So I think actually, whilst the young won't be vaccinated, I think the young will feel possibly that they're safer because they won't be actually infecting the older population if they do go out, because they're safe. So to some degree, I think there will be a slight shift, but actually I think the young are so desperate to get out and to experience bricks and mortar and retail destinations that they will take the fact that the older population are vaccinated as some measure of protection for everyone, and therefore continue to go. So I can't really give you a definitive answer because we've never been in this place before, but all the signs and the sentiments that we're seeing through the media are that the young are quite resilient and are desperate to get out, and I think they will see the benefits of the older population being vaccinated. So I don't see a huge shift in demographics. I think there will still be a reluctance of the older population to shop quite as frequently as they did do, because the nervousness will remain.
Perfect, thank you. Moving on to our next question. I think this will be one for Di and Dominic here. Do you think loyalty to local will remain in, say, 12 months' time post a return to the new normal, or will old habits re-emerge, particularly in food shopping?
Do you want to take that, Dominic? Kick off?
Sure. I think there's a short-term opportunity for local independents to bed in the sort of relationship that they've had with people living locally and working locally. And as I said, I think I touched on this, people become quite habitual quite quickly. So if you build up a good relationship, then that relationship, even if people aren't potentially located close to you anymore, they will still feel some sort of affinity and link to you. And I think it's important to then, as a business, take advantage of that by thinking, okay, what are the different ways that I can continue that relationship with that new customer that I've developed. And it's all about new sales channels, it's all about communication. But I think inevitably, as people begin to move back to city centres to work, there will be a pressure on that, and independents need to be aware about the renaissance of brands and the renaissance of city centres, and almost actively work ahead of that event actually happening. So it's back to that point about it being, I think, short term, but try and make it a long-term relationship if you can.
I agree with you, Dominic. I think that we're all feel quite community spirited at the moment, and we know that a lot of small businesses have had a really tough time. And also it comes back to how convenient it is for all of us. And if it remains convenient for us to visit our local independents and our small high streets, then we will. But as you said, Dominic, as we slowly migrate back to offices, and none of us think that this is going to be a 5-day-a-week migration. It's going to be maybe 1 or 2 days a week. When you're in a city centre and you've travelled half an hour, an hour and a half, or even 2 to get to your office, that is where you will shop if it's most convenient. And also the large multiples are undoubtedly looking at their network and their geographies of their stores and thinking, where should I be placing, particularly in hospitality. We know people like Pret a Manger focus very much on business districts and working populations.
Yep.
That is a strategy I'm sure they are reviewing right now and thinking, how can they reshape their network to address the growing emergence of home working.
Absolutely. Yep.
Great, thank you guys. I have a question for Sophie, and that is, first and foremost, Preparation Pete and Careful Carol are spot on for my parent-in-laws. So there's great confirmation there that personality types and persona types do exist. But the question we have here is, in your consumer types, is social media more important in terms of reliably predicting their individual behavior and spending habits, or because it influences and resonates with others?
So there are 2 ways of answering that question. So the methodology mapper uses social media. That's a big source of data for it, but also news stories, comments, blogs, forums. So it is wider, but it is digital. But we see it as a really valuable data source because it's unfiltered. So we use it alongside research sources like CACI visitor profiles, for example, actual surveys of people on the ground. So we use it alongside more quantitative sources as a way of getting that unfiltered opinion, because sometimes when you ask someone directly, they will skew a bit too positive, or if they're a bit narky that day, they'll be really negative, where actually social gives us a bit more of a balanced view. So it's less about reliability, more about getting closer to what people actually think when they don't know that you're listening, and trying to get that uncensored view. But we always balance it out with more traditional research means to get a full picture. So that's the first thing. We get the question, is it reliable? My audience doesn't use social media, particularly for old audiences, all the time. And what I will say is, even for less digital audiences, still the insights we get are really actually quite representative of what is going on. And I think a testament to that is that a lot of what we've pulled from Mapper was emphasised actually in Diane's presentation from the Springboard research. So what we see is often reflected in reality or indicative of an emerging trend. And because the social data is so real time, we often see things kind of happening before they become manifested through some of those more traditional research methods. So we find it quite reliable, but we do always balance it against other sources. But really the real value of it is how timely and relevant it is and how it's unfiltered. So it really gives us kind of a real picture of how people are thinking and feeling.
Perfect, thank you.
I started talking, did I answer the question?
Yeah.
Perfect. I get so excited.
That's great, well, thank you. And we've got a flurry of questions here, but I'm going to narrow it down just to 2 more questions, conscious of people's time. Another question we have here, and I think this will be for Di. What about the nighttime economy? Do you think there'll be a change in behaviour there?
The nighttime economy is really interesting, actually, because we track footfall by hour at Springboard. So if you imagine 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, we have footfall for every hour of every day, for every device we have installed around the UK, and we have 4,500 of those. And inevitably, with the shift in home working and where we live, and all the changes that are taking place, and our buying habits, as Sophie has talked about, that will drive inevitably a change in when we shop. Realistically, the majority of footfall in any 24-hour period is during the daytime period. So it's about 2/3 to 3/4 of footfall, depending on the type of destination, is in the period from 9 AM to 6 PM. So then in actual numbers terms, the number of people who go out to retail destinations is fairly modest compared to daytime. But of course, it's absolutely critical for a town, high street, city centre, to have nighttime economy, and that feeds also then back into daytime economy, because you might go out for dinner and then you go back for lunch. So there will be changes, particularly if you're not working in the office. You won't necessarily go out for drinks after work as much as you might have done, or you won't go out for a meal straight from the office. But also on a weekday, you won't be out at lunchtime buying a sandwich, and you might make a trip less frequently, but go out in the evening more because you've been at home all day and you don't want to cook in the evening. So there will be changes, but at the moment, because we don't know where we are, and I'm not going to use the word unprecedented, we don't know where we are in terms of what the future way forward might be. We can't say for sure what that change will be, but yes, inevitably there will be change.
Perfect, thank you.
Val, can I just say something on that as well? What we've noticed, in similar to Springboard, we can track visits by hour, and we've noticed that dinner, as consumers sometimes call it, because you can look at it by time of day and also by perception of consumer, has become more important. But obviously that dinner occasion has been in home, largely driven through delivery. But that is going to spill out back onto the streets, back onto retail destinations. And it's been something that the overnight economy has been in growth for several years before COVID struck. So we're going to see that trend appear once more, I think.
Perfect, thank you. And final question I'll end with is, with the closure of large footprint stores such as Debenhams, do the panel see a repurposing to leisure given the high street woes?
Can I just quickly take this and then pass over to Sophie and Dominic? I come from a background of retail and property. So in earlier years, I was working for a large property consultancy, and the repurposing of large footprint stores has been long talked about. And it's absolutely the ideal. If you have a large department store that's no longer a department store, everyone looks and goes, oh, that could make a perfect site for building apartments, and it could, put some leisure in there. There are complications around that and constraints. So if you just think about the floor size of department stores, most of the floor of department stores doesn't have any windows. And so actually, if you're going to build apartments and you're going to use a whole department store for apartments, most of those apartments won't have any windows in them. So it actually feasibly isn't always that possible to do it, but they will be repurposed in some shape or form. And many ways they are some form of accommodation at the top and leisure or retail at the bottom. So where you can have leisure without any windows, they're perfectly suited for it. Indoor putting greens and bowling alleys, they work brilliantly. So yes, they would work. I think the commercial viability of those will need to be assessed, but certainly there is an opportunity there to use space. But I have to say that there are constraints attached to it, and I just really wanted to make that point. So Sophie, Dominic, what do you feel about this?
I think I'm just going to add to that a little bit. So we've done a lot of work looking at commercial property and office space, and a similar question came up actually as a research question, and something we were looking at around what people want from offices. And we've seen where we've moved home, but actually people don't always like working from home, but they do like not going far to work. So one of the suggestions that came out of the research we did was actually we might see repurposing of kind of former retail space into more flexible office space. And working with some flexible office providers, we have seen that they had expanded and they've been looking at acquiring locations over the course of last year. So answering one of the vacancy points that you mentioned earlier, Di. So I don't know about repurposing for other leisure purposes, but I think that kind of changed office space and flexible office space might be something we see emerging a lot more, particularly outside of central London and some of our kind of smaller urban locations where it hasn't previously been seen as an opportunity, but now people are moving to other places, other parts of the UK, and they do still want that balance between home and work. So having a space outside of the home that doesn't require a really lengthy commute, I think could be something interesting to watch out for.
Dominic, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just add to that by saying I think this puts almost operators in the driving seat. Landlords previously they had a strong position, but now that there is higher levels of vacancy, I think operators who are prepared to expand, prepared to maybe go down a pop-up route, pop-up store route, are in a strong position to negotiate well with landlords. And on this point about leisure, I think leisure, let's think more widely than say restaurants. I take your point, Diane. For example, when I went to Slovakia, they're mad about climbing walls in Slovakia, and climbing walls has been a really big growth area recently in London and in other parts of the UK. Finally allowed out of their homes once more. Those experiential destinations are going to become really important once more, and you build something like a climbing wall, and then you have the F&B offer around the climbing wall. I can see a real renaissance of that happening over the next year or so.
Thank you, guys. And as we can see there, a wealth of knowledge around the table, providing insights into them questions. So thank you all for that. Now, unfortunately, that's all the time we have left for questions. But if there are any burning issues or questions you'd like to discuss, we're more than happy to pick these up offline and carry on them conversations. We're conscious that we've discussed a huge amount today and there's been a lot of information to take in. Of all the insights discussed in this webinar, they're all featured in our 2020 annual review, which is available to purchase on our website, and a recording of the webinar will be available for you to watch at your own leisure. On that note, I want to thank you all again and our panelists for joining our webinar. We've been delighted to be able to discuss the report with you, and do feel free to contact marketing@spring-board.info if you want to discuss any content further. We'll be sending out a short survey following the webinar, which we'd love to get your feedback on so that we can continue providing you unrivaled retail intelligence. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.